Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in today's installment of the Avenues to Advocacy virtual workshops. These workshops are intended to help guide you through the process of becoming an influential advocate for the causes most important to you during the 2021 legislative session. Today, we will be discussing a very important topic and bringing awareness to the inequities faced by many individuals and families in our society. Today's panel of experts will share their thoughts and insights on ways you can advocate at a state, local, church, and individual level to assist the children and families in your communities that sadly are dealing with issues of race and food security. After we play a short video and have a panel discussion, please stay tuned with us for live question and answers with some of today's panelists. I am happy to introduce Reverend Dr. Sharon Austin, the Director of Connectional and Justice Ministries with the Florida Conference of the United Methodist Church, who will start our session.
Thank you, Janan, and thank you all for this wonderful invitation. On behalf of Bishop Ken Carter, Florida Conference Bishop, we extend a welcome to each of you. We want you to know that our conference is actively engaged in the work of anti-racism. Therefore, the bishop joins me in thanking you for the opportunity that you've extended to us to share at least some of the work in which we're currently engaged. We're also honored to celebrate the partnership that we have enjoyed over more than 4 decades with the African Methodist Episcopal Church and Florida Impact to End Hunger. It is this concern around the issue of hunger, food scarcity, however you may think of it, that serves as the reason that today's conversation about food scarcity is viewed through the lens of racism. While our methods for some of our training and resources are very unusual during this season of coronavirus pandemic, the subject matter for us today is unfortunately too usual. That is the relationship between food scarcity in particular, poverty in general, and its relationship with racism. While we cannot offer training in this brief span of time, we can begin to raise the level of awareness, and that is actually our task for today. We will prepare to hear from what Janan has referred to as the experts, many of whom are people I'm honored to work with each and every day who really live out and express what it means to connect with people in their times and places of need as they seek to address both their immediate physical needs, but also serve as advocates around the issues with which they are faced. As we prepare to hear from them, you will hear presentations differently if you remember that racism need not be referred to as institutional nor systemic. A paraphrase of the work of Dr. Ibram Kendi would be to say that that is redundant because that is the definition of racism. It is institutional and it is systemic. And it refers very generally to the system of policies and practices which advantage one group while simultaneously disadvantaging other groups. Let's hear now from the panel of our video experts and then our live experts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Austin. So we're going to switch over to the video.
About 11% of households in the U.S. experience some sort of food insecurity in their lifetime. Now, you might think that 11% is not such a high number, but what I want you to think about is this. That number has not changed since 1995. And I want you to digest that for a little bit. I want you to think about that. With all the programs that communities of faith and the government and different organizations have implemented, all the infrastructure that we have to try to solve this issue, that number, that statistic has really not changed since the 90s. Now, Again, 11% is not, it's not too bad. But I want you to think about this other part of it. For Latinos, Blacks, and minority groups, right? African American community and other minority groups, that number is probably about twice as much. So about 22 to 25% of households will experience some sort of food insecurity in their lifetime. Now, why is this important? Well, it is important to understand this because there is a discrepancy when it comes to food insecurity, economics, and minorities. Okay, this is some of the issues, the structural issues that we need to address. For Latinos and African American communities and other minorities, their household incomes are in average between 25 to 30% less than those of whites. And we're talking about people working the same jobs around the same economic groups. Latinos and Blacks usually are about 25 to 30% lower in their income. Again, you add low incomes, higher rates of food insecurity, and you just have a recipe for disaster. Okay, so this is something that we have to target, and these are issues that the church need to address as soon as possible. But the bottom line is that our churches need to start doing something, even if it's something small. Our conversation needs to lead to real changes, and that is in a different levels. We need to implement ministries in our churches that are addressing this issue. We need to target our politicians and do campaigns about changing laws and trying to bring more equality and so on to our nation. And we, at the same time, we need to start targeting teaching and trying to address these issues at a level that allow us to engage into conversations as human beings. We might not agree on everything, but at least it can start a conversation that leads to real change.
Society of St. Andrew is a nonprofit hunger relief organization. We work with farmers to gather or glean food from the fields that is left behind after the harvest because of slight blemishes or size, or for whatever reason they're not able to harvest it. And we distribute that to people who are hungry through food banks, small agencies, pantries, soup kitchens, etc. We also salvage food from trucks that are turned away from grocery warehouses because maybe one box of broccoli is slightly white around the edges, or the size of the cucumber is not the right size. No food safety reasons, just blemish and size reasons, and we distribute that to food banks and agencies that feed the hungry, and we do this nationwide. And I'm part of the Presbyterian Church, and one of my roles with our Presbytery, Central Florida Presbytery, is we also are embracing the racial justice issue, and one of my roles is to educate our congregations. And so it's really hard for me to separate that from what I do with SOSA, because to me it's intertwined. And so I've learned a lot about racial injustice the last couple of years, which, you know, you hear and see and know it's there, but to really be actively involved in it and advocating, you know, for certain justice issues, it brings it to a whole new level. Because we know that, you know, racism is deeply embedded in the life and history of the country. What is so troubling is that racism today is continuing and enduring the legacy of that history. And it just baffles me that we're still having this conversation in 2021. We should be in a place where racism and the effects of structural racism is past tense and doesn't exist, but we're not there. And you know, the fact that we're not there is nothing short of shameful. You know, there's so many threads to systemic racism. You know, the one thread is healthcare, one thread is the housing system, the way it was set up historically. There's you know, there's just mass incarceration, unfair, lengthy terms for, you know, people of color, for non-violent crimes. I mean, all of that threads, all of those threads weave together to increase hunger among those neighborhoods. So it's not just, you know, you can't just feed people and solve the problem of hunger in a community of color. You've got to think about all of those threads woven together, and how can we look at those threads and do something about that. But because it is so complex, you know, we do what we can do. And I think the most important thing we can do is involve our neighborhoods of color in the solutions. Listen to them, get to know our neighbors and see them as our neighbors. And what we're trying to do is avoid this doing for and move it toward doing with. Because there's learning that can happen on both sides of that. And so we see this a lot. We bring, you know, the volunteers, and we also invite people who are hungry themselves to come out and help us. And then they are able to take food back to their home or to their neighbors if needed.
Tell us about the Community Food Pantry at Faith UMC and the need it fills in the community.
The food pantry here at Faith United Methodist Church every Thursday, we have a bag of groceries, a staple kind of bag of groceries that has some canned vegetables, some rice, ramen noodles, canned protein, those kinds of things. And then also, we're real fortunate to be able to have a bag of vegetables, fresh produce. That's a brand new thing that we've just started. And then also that we have some of the day old bread and stuff like that from Publix and from some of the other people that donate those kinds of things to pantries. And so that's what people will see, what they'll get if when they come on a Thursday, is some of those just kind of staples. The need that it fills is actually it's an emergency need. It's one that these are folks that just overall are facing poverty. That underemployed or not employed. All of those kinds of things. So it's an emergency need that we're facing, that we're trying to meet, and just trying to help people to be able to supplement some of their income so that they can pay their rent, so that they can pay their light bill, so that they can pay their car payment and insurance and those kinds of things. Before the COVID pandemic, we would have between 30 to 45, maybe 50 families come on a regular basis to our food pantry. And then after COVID started, and as soon as the layoffs started, we have seen anywhere between 100 to 125 to 135, I think, was our biggest Thursday. And that's every week that there's that many people coming. So, the need has more than doubled since the pandemic started. And there's a lot of hurting people in our neighborhood.
Thank you so much for that. So we will go over to our live panelists who will provide you some information. During this session, while they are speaking, if you have any questions, please be sure to put them into the Q&A or chat box so we can be sure to address them as best that we can as time allows.
Hi, everybody. My name is Erwin Lopez. I am an elder in the Florida United Methodist Church, and I'm also on the Awareness Subcommittee for the Bishop's Anti-Racist Task Force. And I'm the pastor of a college ministry in Orlando at the University of Central Florida. I want to be the facilitator today. I'm going to be asking the questions, and you're going to get to hear from an amazing group of people, an amazing group of leaders, and they're going to introduce themselves right before they answer their questions, so you get to know them a little better. So let's just get right into it. First of all, we want to thank you for coming to today's training on advocacy. So let's just start with that basic foundational question. What is advocacy?
All right, hello, I'm Lynette Fields. I'm the Executive Director of Poverty Solutions Group and a lifelong United Methodist. Poverty Solutions Group is a nonprofit that has three focus areas. One is to help people improve their household income, those who are below 200% of the poverty level, raise community awareness about the causes and obstacles in poverty, and to address the structure and system and policies that keep people in poverty. So for me, advocacy, often people think of changing or creating policy at the local, state, or federal level. And that is definitely a very good definition of advocacy. Often we advocate for ourselves. I think in the faith community, we want to think about advocacy as how can we advocate with others and listening to the community on that. I would also like to add that advocacy can be making available resources known or more accessible. It could even possibly be creating an alternative pathway to access. So one of the things we talk about in our organization is how expensive it is to be poor. Oftentimes people in the middle class don't understand that. It can be more expensive to have a bank account. It can be more expensive to cash checks. Everything is more expensive. You're paying a higher percentage for your food. So how can we create different pathways of accessibility? So those two different definitions.
Great, great, great.
Yeah, I'd like to add, my name's Andy Oliver. I'm a pastor at Allendale United Methodist Church in St. Petersburg. And my pronouns are he, him, his. You know, I imagine everyone here is an advocate. If you've ever said a prayer, then you are an advocate. To pray is to advocate for yourself or for your neighbor. And one of the things that we practice in my community is the practice of listening to those who are facing oppression, listening to those who are the targets of racism, who are being harmed. And even in the midst of worship, right? It's important for me as a pastor to step aside and allow other people to preach and share their testimony, because as we listen to their voices, as we listen to how God is interpreting the scripture through their life and their well-being, then we are moved to be in solidarity with them as their siblings. And so I think a lot of the place where our advocacy starts most often is just from being in relationship and listening to the harm that has been perpetrated, sometimes even by the church.
That's great, Andy. Great feedback. I hope everybody's listening to what our panelists are talking about. Advocacy starts with listening to people, being in a relationship with people, listening to the needs of the community, and then working together to raise awareness, working together for practice and do practical things in the community. So let's transition into a more practical conversation. Not that the previous one wasn't practical, but let's talk about what are the different ways that we can advocate? You know, once we listen to a community, what are different ways that we can advocate?
So a couple of different ways that we get ourselves involved at Allendale in direct advocacy. one, so whenever we see a need or feel a call to advocate, we always partner with those groups that are already doing the work. And typically, if those are Black and Brown people who are being affected, then we partner with Black and Brown led organizations. We don't need to come in and be the face of this, of what's happening, but simply need to oftentimes provide resources and people power and help to organize. The other way that we get involved in direct advocacy is through our elected officials. If there's something on the local level or state level, for example, right now, some of my church are very passionate about having an urban garden to feed those in our city who are living in a food desert. And so we are partnering with our state senator, Darryl Roussan, and our House member, Michelle Rayner. They both have bills in the Florida, up in Tallahassee, that require our direct advocacy. And so we're going to be sending people up there to help speak to those bills in committee. It's going to allow easier access for churches to do urban gardening. It's going to allow the average person to be able to do urban gardening and be able to sell that produce. And so it's going to solve a specific problem that we see. And so in working with our elected officials, we can help further that cause.
And I would just like to say, Erwin, that those of us on the call represent nonprofit and faith-based organizations, and often I think we're a little skittish about the word advocacy, right? So you can get some pushback, and I think it's important to understand what the parameters are. You're not to lobby for a particular candidate, but it doesn't mean that we can't do education. It doesn't mean that we can't provide voices like Andy's talking about that speak from their direct experience. And so I would just like to encourage those that are in the faith-based community and nonprofits to understand what they are able to do, and things like Children's Week and Florida Advocacy Days are a great avenue for us to be able to participate and not have to worry about whether we're staying in our lane or not.
Lynette, hi, everybody. My name's Kim Johnson, and I am the president CEO of Florida Impact. So I'm excited to be here. I have a couple of things that I wanted to share that I've been really thinking about since I've been asked to participate. And there are a couple of simple things, really. One of the things I think that people can do is they can spend time in their community or their surrounding, learn about your community and the people that live in it. I think that you can talk with your friends and your family about issues that are important to you, even the difficult ones. Have those uncomfortable conversations and topics. I also think that you can support products and services that align with your values. Don't support products and services that don't align with your values and your beliefs. Spend your money supporting people and organizations that share your vision for social change and transformation. I recently took an advocacy class with some young students at a local high school. And it was a class that was given by a civil rights attorney. And it was there that I learned about something that we all see on the news and out in social media, but I actually learned a new term, and it's actually called citizens journalism. Citizens journalism is something kind of new, I guess, if we want to say so. And it's basically where individuals who are not trained in journalism, they use social media, blogs, or other outlets to report an incident or event. The deaths of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, and the others might have definitely gone unnoticed without the presence of citizen journalists who provided documentation through video, audio, and the reports on social media. So that's something I think that has been a trend, and it seems as if people are starting to do that to basically get things out into the world that we might not know about.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And you know, Kim, I know we were talking earlier, but you were also talking about one of the things that we can do to advocate is just use your cell phone. How people have been using their cell phones to bring awareness to things happening in the community. And that was a great point. I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, definitely just think about it. It's just in our communities, our young people now. I mean, I live with millennials, so they are constantly using their cell phone, constantly reading emails and tweeting, and the list goes on. So my thing is, this is just a positive way that we can use this information for good. We can basically this is using ways that we don't have to necessarily be trained. I have a daughter that just so happens to be a journalist. But my thing, this could be my way in my community of being able to get something out into the community that's important to me.
Yeah, that's great. I just wanted you to share a little bit more on that to encourage our young people, because
Yes.
young people are often in the forefront of a lot of these movements. So I hope everybody's been hearing about different ways to advocate. Seek partnerships, contact elected officials, research bills. I would add, talk to your pastor. Let your pastor know what is happening in the community. Spend time in the community, talk with friends, talk with family members. So there's so many different ways to advocate. Let's talk about the role that advocacy plays in our discipleship. Let's answer the question, why is advocacy important? How is advocacy part of our discipleship?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Reverend Mary Downey. I am a deacon in the Florida Conference, and I serve as the CEO of a nonprofit called Hope Partnership. We work with families and individuals who are experiencing poverty and homelessness in Central Florida. And I think it's very important for us to think about how advocacy is a part of how we grow ourselves as disciples of Jesus Christ. Those of us with United Methodist leaning, we know that the mission of our church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. We make disciples of Christ because we want to transform the world. And the number one way that we can begin to talk about that transformation is to talk about how we transform it for the kingdom of God. And we can't do that if we're not willing to advocate, if we're not willing to address the things that are evil, the things that are injustice, the things that are oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. That language is directly from, if you're a United Methodist, your baptismal covenant. The idea that there is actual evil at play here when we disenfranchise people, when we experience racism against others, we have to be willing in our covenant to our relationship with Christ and our relationship with each other to change the kingdom of God, bring it here on earth as it is in heaven. All of that is connected. And so I think it's important to start to reckon with ourselves a little bit about places where maybe we felt uncomfortable in being able to speak out on behalf of people who may be having a different experience from our own, and to be able to begin to step into that space in a way that says this is unacceptable, that says that this is not the way that the kingdom of God looks like, and this is not what I will stand for. I know that that's often very hard for a lot of people, and it's not something culturally that we've been conditioned to do, especially if you are a person who is white. Oftentimes we are told to step back and to kind of not step into those spaces because it's not politically correct, or it's not polite, or it's not nice. And I think that we need to start thinking about how we should be convicted in those ways, and think about, would Jesus accept what's happening in this world? Would Jesus accept the ways that racism has disenfranchised people over many hundreds of years? And I think the answer to that is that Jesus would not, that Jesus would be on the side, as Jesus often is, drawing the line in the sand, to show the difference between that Jesus is on the side of those who are experiencing oppression.
That's a great point, Mary, and one that I want to dig into a little bit more, because I love what Mary said when she said, we're here to make disciples and to transform the world, not just the individual, but the world. And as United Methodists, we believe in personal holiness, social holiness. And so anybody want to share a little bit on how we shouldn't be only focused on, you can call it brokenness, injustice, sin, conviction, just on the individual, but we have a responsibility to ask the deeper questions of what's happening in the world. I once heard a pastor said, don't ask how the water boils, just know that it boils. But advocates ask, how does the water boil? Advocates ask that deeper question. Anybody want to share a little bit more on that?
Well, I can tell you that advocacy to me is, using the resources that I have, including my voice, physical presence, money or time, and honor, support, and partner with people and organizations that really are standing for the things that I believe in. I'm working for Florida Impact. We've been a major part of advocacy in the work that we do for the last literally 42 years. We were helping to fight for issues for children, families that are living in marginalized communities along the United Methodist Church and the AME Church, brothers and sisters, when nobody else was. That's what we did. We were there fighting together to create change and to make a difference.
I would add that I think we often focus on individual behavior. And what that does is it puts a tremendous burden on the individual that if they just work harder, make different choices, then everything will be fine. And I think asking the question why, Erwin, like you're suggesting, why this is happening gets us to the larger picture. And we discover that there are policies, systems, and structures in place that make it hard. And no matter how hard the individual works, they can't overcome a policy and structure by themselves. We have to look at these things as a community as a whole to be able to begin to remove obstacles and then begin to reduce and eliminate poverty and hunger and homelessness.
I mean, it goes back to that both and that we all like to carry around, that it is a both and approach. We need to address the things individually that convict us, but we also need to look at the systemic things that should be convicting the world, and those things working in conjunction with one another so that we are able to actually do that work of transforming and transformation that we believe can occur through our faith in Jesus Christ.
Yes, thank you so much, guys, for following up on that. And as a pastor, I want to encourage all pastors, let's not just focus on the individual, but let's focus on what's happening in the world. And we got to preach about both. And speaking of digging a little more deeper in terms of advocacy, as you guys know, the bishop has started the Anti-Racist Task Force. And one of my focuses and our focuses is to bring awareness on the role that racism, anti-racism plays on really everything, on everything. But today, let's talk about the intersection of race and advocacy. First, let's start by defining racism. How would you define racism? And while you're sharing, why are we even talking about racism? I mean, share just as a little reminder. So how would you define racism?
Well, I can say this. People think that racism is just prejudice against someone because of the color of their skin. I think that it's more than just individual actions. I believe, like you all do know, that it's embedded in the institutional and cultural systems. Systems that were set up to prevent Black and brown people living in certain neighborhoods, prevent Black and brown children from going to certain schools. For us to even think right now, why are Black and brown people more likely to die from COVID and less likely to be able to get the vaccine even in their community? Racism is something that I've dealt with every day of my life. I don't have a choice as a Black woman. I just don't have a choice. I dealt with it first, believe it or not, at 3 years old when I integrated the all-white nursery school in my town in Great Neck, New York. I dealt with it at 15 years old when I was first called the N-word while playing field hockey and running down the field. I dealt with it most recently when my daughter and I were called the N-word while eating ice cream in my community. And lastly, you know, I dealt with it when I had to console my 15-year-old daughter after she was called the N-word while on a school Zoom call. So my thing is this, please understand that racism is not about being colorblind, which sometimes I've heard that over and over and over again. I've heard that so many times in my life that it sometimes just makes me sad. We got to understand that being colorblind is ignoring the lived experiences of Black and brown people. You have to be, as young people say today, they use the word woke, you know, you got to be woke. So what I'm saying to you is this is what I want you to do. I want you to acknowledge me as a Black woman. You know, it's okay. It's okay to say, I see you, Kim. I see the oppression that you are going through. I see the oppression that we have seen for many, many, many years to come, you know. And it's okay for us now, and this is a perfect time for us to be having this kind of conversation as a Black woman. For us, that's the only way true change is going to come, for us to be able to talk about racism and acknowledge that it exists. And because together we can accomplish it, we just have to acknowledge that it does exist.
Yeah, Ibram Kendi in the book How to Be an Anti-Racist uses that term anti-racist really as an invitation to action. It is not so much about who we are, but about the choices we make. So you often hear people, especially white people, get defensive about the term racist and talk about the past and not having responsibility for things that happened before we were born, right? But if you use the term anti-racist, it means choosing every day to act against policies that favor one group of people over another. And then the onus is on our daily actions. And really, we get to choose every day to start over. And we look at the present and the future by focusing on dismantling these systems and structures that have perpetuated racism for really the entirety of the existence of our country.
You know, last thing, I'm sorry, before I forget.
Go ahead.
Okay, advocacy, I believe that advocacy is the tool to fight against racism. However, we need to acknowledge all the ways that the systems of oppression intersect. How many times have you heard people say, I'm not a racist? But guess what? As Lynette said, it's not enough to say that you are not a racist. You have to be anti-racist. You have to do the work to truly understand and educate yourself about the system and how it affects people of color. Then, and only then, will you make change.
One of the ways that my church is dealing with the question of anti-racism and being advocates is starting with ourselves. So my church is almost 100, and that's several generations of a predominantly white space. Even as we're starting to become more multicultural, we still are holding on to that whiteness as normative. And so one of the things that we are going to undergo is an anti-racial audit as a part of our church to analyze where do racist practices still exist within our body. And that will involve listening to other people of color, Black and brown people, and examining our history so that we can come out with some real concrete changes to start to dismantle that white center of our congregation so we can look more like beloved community, more like the kingdom of God. Someone asked in the questions, what does woke mean? I think of the disciples asleep in the garden. And I think that's where we've been the last 100 years at Allendale United Methodist Church. And Jesus is saying, wake up. And so this is part of our process of waking up.
I love everything you guys are sharing, and I want to thank you so much. One of the things that I hear as you guys share is that we should get to the point where, and I think the younger generation is doing this really well, we're normalizing certain things, like we're normalizing talking about mental health. And I like us to get to the place where we normalize conversations about race. And colorblind theology does not lead to normalizing conversations about race. And also, I love what one of you guys said, talking about we need to be doing this every day. I kissed my wife today when I left, and I said, I'll see you later, honey. I'm going to go fight racism. And this is something that we need to talk about every single day because people are dealing with it every single day. And so to not talk about it is almost like a privilege. It's a privilege to not talk about it. So the question that you guys all answered, I don't know if anybody has any closing remarks to the intersection between racism and advocacy. How does racism and advocacy connect? If not, I want to move to some practical ways that we can help advocate something like food insecurity in the world. So you guys want to move on to the last question? I know we got probably 5 minutes left. Let's move on to that last question. Good? All right. So what are some practical ways to advocate for something like food insecurity in the community? Or something that somebody researches and they find out, our church, our community, I want to do something. What are some practical ways to start?
I just wanted to say in general that some things we can put into practice have to do with becoming better aware, as we've talked about. And Sharon's going to give us some resources. One resource that has been extraordinarily helpful for us is an exercise from Bread for the World called Racial Wealth Gap. That helps you to be woke, as we're talking about. Also, Barbara mentioned this in her video portion about making it more personal. I think knowing people by name is really, really important. And talk about names and not just numbers in the work that we do. And then the final thing I'd like to say is, where are people who are being impacted by the work that we do? Where are they in the decision-making spaces and places? How, not just listening, but moving aside and hearing people, and how we structure our organizations and how do we make decisions in our organizations. That's not specifically about food insecurity, but it's a pathway to talk about specific issues, including food insecurity.
I think if I was going to add on to that, I'm sorry, Kim.
No, go ahead.
Right, okay. I would just say that, and Reverend Andy said this a little bit earlier, work with people who are already in the field. Sometimes I think when we hear something like this, we do get a little convicted and we want to go out, we want to get started, but really do your research about who is already doing good work in your community. Oftentimes our resources can go a lot farther if we are willing to collaborate with other churches, collaborate with other nonprofits, work together to address these issues, especially around food insecurity. You can go a lot farther when it comes to feeding people if you're working with 2 or 3 churches instead of each church having their own small food pantry. And so I would just encourage you to look around at your community and see who is doing what work already. And then if there are gaps, talk to your church, talk to your community about how do we start filling in these gaps. And again, doing it in the way that Lynette has mentioned, of talking to the people who you would be serving and make sure that they are a part of that decision-making process.
Yeah, thanks, Reverend Mary. If we start to target, I believe, the root causes of hunger and food insecurity, and help those who are most disadvantaged, I believe that is truly a start. We must advocate for equity. People in need to get the resources that will help pull them out of the situation that they're in. Especially those who seem to struggle day after day after day, year after year after year. Those that are struggling just for basic things is putting food on their table. But just think about it. If they're struggling with trying to put food on their table, then guess what? There's some other things that they're struggling, with. So we have to continue to fight for the expansion of SNAP, and getting families enrolled in SNAP. We need to advocate and strengthen the Fair Housing Act, right? We need to train health professionals, on how they need to understand sometimes their racism beliefs. And what about, ending criminalization
Oh no, we're losing Kim a little bit. Is it just me or we're losing Kim a little bit?
minor racial.
Okay.
So there's lots of places where food insecurity and the root of why people are being. So,
looking at the whole picture, I think food pantries are great and gardens are great, and we should all be involved in feeding those directly who are hungry, because that's what Jesus did. But what also Jesus did was challenge systems that put people in poverty, challenge those occupying forces, right? So as we look to maybe make sure that Florida follows through on this $15 minimum wage, or other policies, making sure in my own town, there's a 6-mile radius with no grocery store. And guess what? It happens to be where all Black people live, a food desert. And so what would it look like for churches on the north end of town to pull together and advocate to make sure that a grocery store in that location is prioritized, working with people that are in their own neighborhood. And so the way we can solve systems and not just continue to feed people, that is very important. But we also have to do the work of justice, which enables people to be able to put their own food on their plate.
Great thoughts, everybody. I know our time is almost up. We have about 30 minutes. We're going to get into some Q&A now. I just want to add one thing, if I may. Being on the awareness committee has taught me that there's a lot of people who are not even at the awareness level. So never assume that everybody's at the awareness level. And one of the ways that I've been seeing how we can advocate is finding out where people are. Most people are either at the awareness level or not even on the awareness level, at the practice level or the accountability level. And then when you think about kind of churchy terms, I think about orthopathy, orthodoxy, and orthopraxis. Orthopathy is about having the right affections. And so we want people to feel the pain. And you feel the pain when you commit, when you listen to your community. Get people to feel, to have a passion in their heart to advocate. Then get people thinking. That's orthodoxy. Get people thinking about what they can do. Get them talking, get them sharing ideas. And then finally get to the point where you do something. That's that orthopraxis. And so find out where people are, move them pastorally or prophetically, and get to know your community. Not just the little corner or the suburb that you're a part of. Get to know your entire community and listen to the stories of your neighbors. That's what I would say. Let's move on to the Q&A. I know that our leader here, Janan, today will be helping with the Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm so glad and so thankful to have all of you here with us today, sharing your information, sharing your insights. We do have a few questions that have come in. The first one is, what advice or tips can you share to engage quote unquote outsiders in communities that are primarily segregated?
You know what? I'll start that way. It's funny. When I moved here from New York 30 years ago, I was considered an outsider, and I worked in communities where people looked like me, but they still saw me as an outsider. So what I needed to do, the tip that I knew that I had to do is I had to let the community know that I was there because I wanted to be there. I had to let them know just because I was a Black woman, I might look different than them, or I might sound different than them because I was a New Yorker, coming straight from New York, but but my heart was there with them, and they needed to believe that. So my tip is really not being afraid to be out there into the community, because people are looking at your heart, and if you, sometimes I know it's different, but they are looking at that. And once they see that value, then they will accept you and accept the work that you want to do in their community, because you're being real, you're being true, you're being authentic. So my tip is to just be real, authentic, and true. That's my tip.
And I would add patience, right? So, or persistence, or both, right? So we have to understand, it goes back to understanding some of the structures and systems so that we can understand why there might be a lack of trust and not wanting an immediate solution, especially once again, as somebody from the white middle class, often in church people, I've been a church person my whole life, we like the immediate. We like seeing the tangible results, usually right before our eyes. We're often not patient. And so I think if we understand why people, there may be a lack of trust, then we can take the time to be present. And I have found, as Kim is saying, presence and walking alongside goes a long, long, long way. And where we locate our ministries or our organizations is just as important as the counterpart of making space at decision-making tables is where do we locate ourselves so we see what's going on and we hear what's going on.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you both for sharing that. I have another question for you here. So how can we help support the intergenerational strength in advocacy efforts? That's including all generations of the family, from your elders and your grandparents to the youth.
A few years ago, after the Parkland shooting, it's something that many of our churches and communities thought of ways to respond to and advocate for that horrific incident. And so here, we, of course, started to partner with different groups. A lot of the groups that have been meeting here at the church, we allow any group in the community that's doing the work of justice and anti-racism to have free meeting space. We let that known everywhere we go. If you're doing the work of anti-racism and justice, you have free meeting space here. And that has changed the DNA of who my church is, because also some of those people who go to those meetings want a theological undergirding for the work they're doing. And so we've kind of cross-pollinated. And because of that, we were able to have an immediate vigil. But what also happened with that is there was a local high school that had planned a rally, and because of some threats by the NRA, they canceled the rally. And so the school immediately knew that Allendale was a space that offered free, we were known for giving away free space. And we were able to host all the high schoolers to lead their own rally, which got my children involved. And so I would just say, wherever there is opportunity, wherever there is hurt, wherever there is oppression that's happening, showing up, being present, but also opening up your space or whatever resources you have can be an outlet to that looking for those opportunities for cross-generational ministry where it's appropriate, thinking intentionally about how can a 5-year-old participate in this initiative that we are working on. Can they draw a picture? If we're sending letters to our governor, what can I do to encourage my children's ministry to participate in this? If it's an issue that affects them directly or their friends directly. And so it just takes some intentionality, I think.
Yeah, I think I would echo that in the sense that also it does, especially if we're talking about it in a church context, it does need to reflect in all places. So oftentimes children are not often included in acts of worship. They're often put into other spaces with different curriculum. And if you're a pastor or a church leader who's going to be focusing towards these types of issues, but that you have an entirely different children's curriculum that is only talking about personal holiness, that's going to become their foundation. And so you really do have to start looking at your entire church curriculum, your entire way that you're teaching it. If you want this to be intergenerational, now to make sure it reflects in all the different spaces where children and adults are.
I remember I was invited once to St. Luke's United Methodist Church years back, and it was probably one of the most exceptional experiences I had with young people. And I was actually asked to come and speak to a group of kindergartners and first grade students that were talking about learning what legislation meant and how to advocate. And I was talking to them, these 5-year-olds, about SNAP back then. Back then, it wasn't called SNAP; it was called, food stamps. But we were actually changing the way we were talking about it. And I actually talked to these 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds about what it meant to be food insecure. And I remember bringing an example of a SNAP card that I had borrowed from somebody to show them what the government was trying to do to make people feel less ashamed of having a food stamp versus having something that looked like a credit card. I remember having that conversation with them. And then we went on and wrote letters. They were barely writing, but they had their grown-ups there that were with them. And these children were 5 and 6 years old. And that was something that the grown-ups and the young children did together. So that stuck with me from then till now. And I'm sure there are other ways that you all can think of joining your generations together in your churches so that they can learn from each other. That to me is the way to go.
I just share real quick because one of the things I encourage us to do is study the culture. Like the older generations, they have symbols, they have language, they have values, they have things that are important to them. And there are things that just wasn't part of that generation. And then study the younger generation, their symbols, their values, their language, and then figure out how to talk to both of them and integrate them. I wrote here, potluck meets TikTok, something like that. Just integrate, study both cultures and learn how to bring them together. I mean, and study it, think about it. So
love it.
Well, and I have found many young people, children, have an innate sense of fairness. So I think those of us who have become more cynical as we get older, we need that, right? We need that fresh look on a sense of justice. And then the experience that older people have is often helpful in how do you engage in advocacy and legislation. Let's save time by being able to listen to that experience and instead of having to learn it from square one. So instead of this, kind of generational war, we need each other. We need the gifts of each generation. And I find young adults just so much more justice wired than my Gen X generation was, for example. And I love that. I love that revitalization, and it gives me energy. It's not a threat, it's a gift.
Very quickly, I want to echo something Lynette was talking about, and that's just listening to where the kids are and what they're passionate about. My son came home from school one day. A Syrian refugee was placed in his classroom, and he heard on the news that night that state legislators were trying to ban them. And he was crushed that someone would try to ban his friend. And so I set up I said, well, we can write a letter. And then I set up a meeting for him to go and talk to one of the state legislators about his friend. Listen to where their hearts are and help them gain the tools to have their voice be heard.
Thank you so much. Yes, I love that you've given so many great examples where you can bring the full family in. And that is what Children's Week is about, is giving those advocacy efforts for children, youth, and families across the board. So thank you so much for all of this information and all of these great tips. I do have one more question for you. So Ms. Kim, if you can talk a little bit more about if someone else were that one individual, if they were that one African American or that one Asian American in their church or in their community? How do they really start to speak?
How do they start to speak? Well, I'd say to not be afraid and know that it's okay to be the only one. Sometimes I think sometimes we're, we're just uncomfortable about being that only one. I know I've been the only one lots of times, and my children have been the only one lots of times, and I've had to, you would hope that the grown up in that person's life, or even if you are a grown up, that you somehow have the self-confidence to know that, okay, you can do it, you're making a difference. Somebody had to be the first, right? And basically to be able to walk in whatever space you are, and knowing that you're getting ready to make difference, make a change, because if you don't make that change, it will never happen. I had the opportunity with my youngest daughter, when that situation that I talked about, where she was called the N-word, she had a choice. And yes, she is one of the few African Americans at her school. So she had a choice at that time to be angry, be sad, be upset. And I basically said, what are you going to do? Let's get over it. And what are you going to do? So she said, Mommy, I want to make a difference. So she created the first Black student union at that particular school. And that was her way of, if anybody else felt like they were going to be the only one, she wanted to show support to them. So basically, I'm just saying, not be afraid to be the only one, and it's okay. And sometimes just open yourself up to the people who are there, and you'll be surprised how much you will learn from people that might not look like you. And I guarantee you, they are definitely going to learn from you. So my thing is to not be afraid and to open yourself up and to just accept that it is okay to be the only one.
Can I just add to that real quick? Because I've been the only person of color in many rooms. And I've been listening to an early civil rights leader, and he talks about how be careful, because people of color are often given platforms because the people who gave them that power know that they're not going to say anything. So think about that. Think about that. And I've been in those spaces. I've been in those spaces, and I've been the person who hasn't said anything. And let me tell you, I live with that regret. So I wish I could offer you advice, but I was afraid of losing my job. I was afraid of losing my job. So I would say use wisdom, talk to people who have experience in this and how they've navigated these spaces, and take it step by step. Tread lightly. And if you're gonna tread boldly, be ready to lose your job. Be ready for some repercussions. But Irwin, it's tough.
The crazy thing is that you all who are listening and seeing, I guess while I think about it, I'm the first African American that Florida Impact has hired as their CEO. I'm the first. I didn't think about that until after, so I'm walking in many spaces where I am the only, and you are so right about that, Irwin. We got to be careful, and we must be ready for that, and show wisdom, because much is given, much is required. So thanks for asking that question, whoever asked that.
Great question.
An awesome question.
Yes, we've had a wonderful audience. I know we're getting close to our hour here, so we'll let Dr. Austin close it out, and then we'll give you a Children's Week closing message.
Thank you, Janan, and thanks to each of you for the incredible wisdom and vulnerability that you showed, and to all of the folks who have been a part of our time together today. Just some quick reflections, but I hope important to you as I listen to our panelists. Reverend Mary Downey included in the chat just a word about mercy, and how mercy is really a short-term solution, often to a more chronic issue that is a justice-based issue. I would just challenge us to remember that one of the places where we can get tripped up with ministries or works of mercy is that it makes the helpers feel good. We feel good when we're able to serve people through a food bank or a clothing closet or a rental assistance or whatever it is. But instead, our goal ought to be working ourselves out of a job. And so while we often say we used to serve this many families, well, would you believe it? Now that number has tripled. That's not a goal. And when Jesus says, the poor you will have with you always, he doesn't intend that to be the standard. That's not the goal. But for the hardness of our hearts, that ends up being the case. And so we are always endeavor to work ourselves out of a job. And when we practice justice through advocacy, then we have a much better chance of diminishing the profound need with which communities are faced. One of the ways to think about food scarcity, housing, just the incredible needs that people have right now might be for us to think of our brothers and sisters in Texas. Here in a country that is a country of significant sources, we have people who are in need of food, clothing, housing. They don't have electricity. They have been cold for more days than they can count. And a question or a thought might be to look at those folks and think about the number of times we've said over the past few days, this is terrible, this is horrible, oh, those poor people. And then ask ourselves what it means for people who live in those circumstances chronically, sometimes even generationally. They are people who are created by God and loved by God, and they are deserving as well. And when we put different faces or different names on the people for whom we feel so badly, then that gives us a window into how we might address some of these concerns. I'm very grateful for the who, what, where, why of advocacy and how we might do it. And I hope that wherever you have heard the reference to church, you have translated that to the appropriate references to your faith community. And if you're not a part of a faith community, then I hope that it is able to be translated to your own personal practice and philosophy. I would also say that you can make a difference in all of the ways that we've heard. People often think they have to be able to go to the other side of the world and, solve hunger in another country, but they do that with a view that completely skips their community, completely leaps over where children are and the value that they bring to this conversation and the insights they share. And so they're just incredible opportunities for us always. I wanted to share a couple of resources, and I think maybe they will be in the chat. You've heard a few references to Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Well, guess what, folks? There's actually a book entitled exactly that. And because we offer this through our Children's Week platform, I want you to know Dr. Kendi has also offered Anti-Racist Baby. So for everything we've heard about how and when we begin with children, guess what? This is the beginning. We start here, then we'll have less work to do maybe when we get here. And finally, another book I would offer is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. We have to do the work ourselves. And so if it makes you feel a little uncomfortable, if you hear it from a person who represents others, do the work yourself and begin to talk and do the learning and share opportunities for awareness within your own community. Finally, just on a personal note, I would say I am married to someone who grew up in a food scarce household. 60 years later, the pain and the shame of that still exists in a man who is no longer hungry just about every day of his life. And so we may think when we see people who live in circumstances that everything is okay because they received a meal today, but it leaves an indelible imprint on how they think of themselves, and maybe more importantly, how they think society thinks of them. So this is the time not only to provide food and meals, but to begin to feed the spirit and the determination and the destinies of so many people. When I learned Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world. I wish someone told me what Jesus's love really meant for all of those children. So today is the beginning, and we can make a difference beginning today, and it will change all of the tomorrows in the future. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so very much. We are so grateful and so thankful for your time today. And we look forward to other opportunities to learn about being anti-racist and being able to be present. And that's one of the values and goals of Children's Week, is being that person, being able to speak up. Your one voice counts, no matter how small you may think it is. So we thank you for joining us today for this Avenues to Advocacy workshop. And we hope this session has inspired you to go out and advocate for other issues and other things in your life that are most important to you. So we will be wrapping up. We invite you to join us starting on March the 15th, as we'll kick out, instead of it being a Children's Week, it'll really be a Children's Month. So from March the 15th to April the 12th, we'll have various virtual activities and events, including a virtual Children's Day and Teen Town Hall, an opportunity for you to network and engage with our wonderful community and statewide partners. And also we'll have some additional workshops coming soon. So please visit our website at www.childrensweek.org. Thank you again, everyone. Please stay safe and take care.